Hey folks, got some recent reads to talk through. There are 10 books on the docket. A lot of these were winners for me. I'll be going through these in ascending order based on my personal enjoyment. We're kicking things off at the bottom with Caine by alia trabucco zeran. This is a Chilean literary thriller that just overall felt kind of flat for me. The story here is told entirely through the monologue of this maid named Estella, who we learn from page 1 is being held in this interrogation room. And she is recounting the events that have led up to the death of the young daughter of the wealthy family that she has worked for the past 7 years. And so through Estella's perspective, we are getting an intimate look at the dynamics within this family, at how they treat Estella, and we also just get to see like how dehumanizing and isolating this type of job can be. So it's very much an exploration of class differences, of wealth inequality, as well as power. There were things that I liked in this. I thought there were some compelling aspects to Estella's character. This woman has a lot of pent-up rage and self-loathing. There are moments where she will like dissociate from her body. And then probably the biggest highlight of the book for me was her relationship with Julia, the young daughter. This is someone who Estella has practically raised, and so there are moments where she is very motherly and affectionate towards her, but also this child is awful, and so she will like lord herself over Estella because she can. And yeah, I would say their interactions were my favorite scenes in the book. In terms of what didn't work for me, like outside of the moments I just talked about, everything else was like pretty forgettable to me. All of the class stuff just kind of plays out exactly as you would expect it to in terms of like the parents' personalities, their parenting style. They clearly don't respect Estella as a person, and it's very much rich people doing all the bad things, which was not interesting to me. There's also sections of this book that become like meditations on grief and death, and I would say the author's approach to those sections, the tone, it just veered into overwrought and pretentious territory for me, unfortunately. There's clearly a point in the book where we're meant to feel like incredibly sorry for the narrator. I was just not there emotionally for her. The last thing I'll mention is the way that this story is told. The narrator will interrupt herself by directly addressing the detectives that she's supposedly talking to. She'll say things like, write that down, don't be shy, or listen up, I'm getting to the good part. And I just don't think a narrative device like that is ever going to be a huge hit for me. It'll be quite the opposite, actually. So yeah, some things I liked, but overall, like kind of a lukewarm experience. You Are Here by David Nicholls. This is British contemporary lit fic. It's by the same author that wrote One Day, which I've not read, but I am a fan of the Netflix show, so wanted to give this a go. Ended up just being an okay read for me. The story here is a dual POV romance. The two main characters here are in their late 30s, early 40s. They're both divorced, childless, and experiencing varying degrees of depression. And through the matchmaking efforts of a mutual friend, they end up going on this week-long hike together. And of course, over that time, they end up helping each other emotionally process some baggage and fall in love. This is very much one of those midlife chick lit type of books. People are dealing with trauma. It's about aging, what that does to friendships, and also what it's like being in a very different stage of life relative to your peers. I did enjoy the writing in a lot of places. It's got a nice flow. It has that quirky flavor that is popular in a lot of contemporary lit fic nowadays. And there were definitely some moments I really resonated with. Like there's this one specific awkward interaction I feel like you can have with someone who you meet for the first time, and it just becomes so clear that you don't vibe no matter how hard you try in the conversation. We get a couple of scenes like that in this book, which I thought were on the money. In terms of what didn't work for me, I am definitely just kind of persnickety when it comes to the male characters in love stories. I wanted the male character in this book to be less flawed. He kind of came off as like a limp fish, unfortunately, and I thought the heroine, based on her actions in the book, just deserved better, to be honest. And then the worst part of this book, by far to me, was the banter. Like the fact that this author could write what I thought were really insightful and relatable moments and then turn around and deliver banter like this was surprising, to say the least. And I actually liked how some of the nonverbal chemistry was conveyed in this book, but anytime these two characters attempted to riff with each other, the book became borderline unreadable to me. So yeah, I think this was a fine read for what it is. Had stuff I appreciated, but also some of the key points to this book just missed the mark. On the Beach by Nevil Shute. I would categorize this as like an apocalyptic slice of life book. It was published in the 50s, and it's actually the second book that I've read from this author, the first one being A Town Like Alice, which I read last year and loved. This one I love less. In terms of the setup, I think this is supposed to take place like around the time it was written, so around the 50s. But in this version of the world, World War III has just taken place, and a bunch of countries have just nuked the shit out of each other. And the fallout of that is there are now lethal amounts of radiation in the atmosphere, initially concentrated in like the northern hemisphere where all the bombing took place, but it is slowly but surely making its way across the globe. So humanity is faced with its imminent extinction. We're following a handful of characters in Australia, which is a country that hasn't been like bombed outright, but everybody is just waiting to die from radiation sickness in like 6 months. And so the story is really taking a look at how different people face the final moments of their life and what dying with dignity means to each of them. It definitely presents a very optimistic picture of humanity relative to a lot of other apocalyptic literature, which, you know, I think you can gripe over in terms of the realism of a scenario like this, but every single character in this book is just kind-hearted and decent. They are trying to live their lives as normally as possible. People are going sailing, they're going fishing, they're tending their farm. And so the story has this very melancholic coziness to it. There's also this doomed romance that happens between two specific characters, which was my favorite part of the book. I'd say the other parts of the book that stood out to me were the scenes involving a submarine. One of the characters is this naval captain, and we're following him on these submarine expeditions as he tries to make contact with people in these highly radioactive zones. They're peeking through periscopes at these northern coastlines, and so we get imagery of just how desolate the world looks with like the majority of the population having been annihilated. I thought those scenes were like really quietly terrifying. In terms of the writing style, I definitely remember having a more positive impression of it when I read A Town Like Alice. But yeah, I mean, it's definitely very straightforward, unpretentious. Some might even say dull. It was still very readable to me, and I definitely appreciate that none of the emotional moments ever came off as like total sentimental slop, which is important to me. I will say though, this was definitely a case where I very clearly cared so much more about specific characters over others, and so there were quite a few places in the story that I just felt less engaged by overall. I'll also say where I think this author's writing shines is in detailing some of the small and quiet moments in everyday life, and also in his character interactions. Where I don't think this author's writing shines is in writing motorsports action sequences, which surprisingly features in this book. It was a subplot for a character that I didn't care about, and it just stuck out as like especially dry and dull to me. I really could have done without that whole character, to be honest. So yeah, not mad at this one, but definitely a step down from A Town Like Alice in my mind. The Caine Mutiny by Herman Wouk. This is a World War II story. It was also a Pulitzer Prize winner in the 50s, and I would say overall it was a solid read for me, though there is one glaring issue, which I'll get into, though it does involve some spoilers. In terms of the story, most of it takes place on this minesweeping ship called the Caine. There is a new captain that comes on board named Queeg, and really the story is about the events and circumstances that will ultimately lead the crew members to commit mutiny against this new captain, and we also get to see some of the fallout of that decision. Thematically, I think the story is really about the tragedy of war. It's about the burden of leadership, it's about loyalty, and what happens when loyalty is expected and demanded, but completely unearned. I thought there was lots to like about this book. Great dialogue that was snappy and engaging. A lot of the humor landed for me. I would say the tone of this book for the entire first half is surprisingly very lighthearted and almost slapstick in a way. Like when we're first introduced to the ship, it's like a piece of junk. It's very clear that we're not dealing with the cream of the crop by Navy standards. I thought there were quite a few standout characters. We're mainly following the perspective of Willie, who starts out as like the naive young new naval officer. There's also Kiefer, who he's the seasoned veteran on board the ship, who's very cynical and is doing like the quiet quitting thing because all he wants to do is spend time on the novel that he's writing. I really liked both Willie and Kiefer's character arcs. They just felt like really messy and complicated people. And I think there are some surprising turns in how those two characters are meant to be perceived by the reader. That said, all of the characters pale in comparison to the star of the show, who is Captain Queeg. Truly one of the most memorable characters I've ever read. This man comes on board. He tries to shake up the culture of the ship, and you very quickly learn that this man is a total clown show. Like, to the point where he becomes a cartoon character. It's not realistic at all, which I didn't mind that here because I thought it kind of fit with the tone. But yeah, he's just truly that smarmy and incompetent as a leader. Every single scene this man is in, he is either like actively being a coward, or he's fumbling some naval operation. This man can't even dock a ship. Or he's pointing fingers, or he's asking for useless reports to be written, or he's punishing his men for some minor infraction. And so a lot of the fun in this book was seeing how the various crew members reacted to Queeg's nonsense, which just continues to escalate over time. And it leads to some great moments in this book. In terms of some of the issues, yeah, this was written in the 50s, so, you know, there's definitely stuff that didn't age well here. Willie has this storyline with his love interest. Could have missed me with that. I would say the writing style is generally very easy to read here, but whenever there's any sort of dramatic scene involving the safety of the ship or any sort of naval operation, those would have hit a lot harder for me if I knew what the heck was going on. But some of the descriptions get kind of heavy with the technical naval jargon, and so I just didn't have the context to really visualize jack shit. And now I'm finally getting to the most glaring issue of this book for me. And I'm sorry, I'm going to have to get into spoilers here, but basically I think the entire point of this book was to have the mutiny situation come across as a morally ambiguous decision, which is too bad because it absolutely was not for me. Like, I cannot emphasize enough how despicable Queeg was as a character. I thought he made decisions that endangered the lives of the crew. He was not open to constructive feedback. I thought the second in command could have easily replaced him at any point. And also, like, the actual mutiny part was like pretty chill, all things considered. It wasn't even a physical confrontation. I wanted to get physical. The second in command was just like, Captain, I am relieving you of duty. I think you're mentally unwell, and we're just not gonna listen to you anymore. It was so underwhelming. So yeah, Kui gets little to no sympathy from me, and I reject all attempts made in the last quarter of this book to make his actions out to be more nuanced than they were written as. So yeah, that kind of left a bad taste in my mouth, but honestly, I've just been kind of pretending that those parts don't exist in the book. Takedown, inside the fight to shut down Pornhub for child abuse, rape, and sex trafficking by Laila Mickelwait. I picked this up from a list of recently released nonfiction books, and apparently this was pretty widely reported on a few years back. I had no idea this had happened. Apparently in 2020, there was a ton of public backlash against Pornhub for knowingly hosting and profiting from videos of confirmed child exploitation and rape on their website. There ended up being enough public pressure on the business that they deleted something like 80% of their revenue generating content. So it was something like 13 million videos went down to like 3 million almost overnight. And then most importantly, all of the major credit card companies were also pressured to drop Pornhub, which was a huge financial blow to the business. There were a lot of people that were involved in uncovering all of the dirt on this company, but one of these supposedly key figures that had been involved in this fight at a really early stage was this author. And so this book is her personal account of the day-to-day groundwork that she put in to try to bring this company to justice. It does talk through in very explicit detail some of the illegal video evidence that she reviewed and documented. It gets into some of her experiences talking with victims as well as whistleblowers and journalists. And you're kind of just watching her be like a total dog. She's constantly tweeting to raise awareness. She is hounding the credit card companies incessantly. She's trying to get the government involved. She ends up coordinating with a pretty influential lawyer as well as this billionaire activist, Bill Ackman, who is actually the one that really strong-armed the credit card companies. And we also get to learn a bit about the history of MindGeek, which is the parent company of Pornhub, kind of what the leadership team looked like. And it also gets into specific detail of just how completely fucked some of the business practices were. Like before all this went down, there were intentionally zero guardrails on what was uploaded. Literally anybody could have uploaded anything. And this company's idea of a compliance department was having a team of like 20 moderators physically scrubbing through porn videos, sometimes with the sound off, and using that to make judgment calls on whether or not the people in those videos were consenting and of legal age. I mean, first of all, like I can imagine this position posing some recruiting challenges for this business. And then second of all, like what the actual fuck? Like that was the only checkpoint for the videos being uploaded. And there were millions of videos getting uploaded in a year. It's just so surprising this didn't really seem to be on the FBI's radar at all. And so yeah, this ended up being a pretty depressing read. You just get the sense that there's so much demand for this type of content. So I feel like it's unclear whether or not taking down Pornhub would even really make a dent in like the production of this type of content. But yeah, I thought this was an interesting and informative read. There are a couple of things I would flag though. This author apparently has ties to certain Christian organizations that might have been a sketch. She addresses that in the book. I did not look deeply into it, but just flagging it for folks here. Also, in my opinion, I really don't think there was a ghostwriter involved in this book. I think she wrote this, and she's not like a professional investigative journalist or a professional writer. So this definitely feels unpolished, a bit self-aggrandizing at times. There's a couple of areas I wish she could have gone deeper into, like the business model of Pornhub. I wanted to know like who were their top advertisers by revenue. I don't know if she was allowed to disclose that. Overall, I thought this was a worthwhile read and definitely respect the hustle because ultimately there were drastic consequences for the company, and I think there are still pending criminal lawsuits being brought against MindGeek as well as against individuals within the former ownership group. The Talented Mr. Ripley by Patricia Highsmith. This is a psychological noir thriller that was published in the 50s. It's my first time reading from this author. This is, I think, considered a classic. It comes highly recommended and it did not disappoint. The story here follows our titular character, Tom Ripley, who is this 25-year-old grifter living in New York City. He, at the beginning of the book, is approached by this wealthy man who has it in his head that Tom is like really close friends with his son, whose name is Dickie. And so this man offers Ripley an all expenses paid trip to Italy in order to convince his son to return to America. In reality, I think Tom and Dickie are like barely acquaintances, but Tom doesn't really have many prospects in New York City, and so he decides to go. And when he gets to Italy, he quickly becomes very obsessed with Dickie and his lifestyle. He manages to ingratiate himself with Dickie. They become roommates, and the rest of the book is really about the lengths to which Ripley will go in order to maintain this ideal life that he envisions for himself. It goes to some pretty dark places because it becomes very clear that Tom Tom through his actions and inner monologue is a complete egotistical sociopath. So I would say in some ways this kind of reminded me of The Stranger by Albert Camus, but here thematically I would say a lot of this explores the idea of self-reinvention, the corrupting effects of personal greed and envy, and what happens when you are like constantly faced with an identity crisis because your position in the world, how you're perceived in it, just doesn't match what you want it to be. And in the case of this character, that causes him to do some very evil and bad things. I thought his character study was really compelling. He's super scrappy and smart, but also, like I said, deeply sociopathic and kind of like a weasel of a man. His inner monologue is very neurotic and petty. He's constantly belittling people, calling them bores. I thought there were some really shocking and unhinged character moments and lots of tension-filled scenes as well. I really enjoyed how Ripley's relationship with Dickie played out. I think parts of it hint at like repressed sexuality on Ripley's side, and yeah, there's just all these subtle changes in Dickie's behavior based on how his perception of Ripley changes, which ultimately serves as like the catalyst for all of the major events in this book. And yeah, I thought the evolution of that relationship was really well done. The really only minor gripe I had was there's some parts that dragged for me in the back half. Like there's not actually a ton of plot in this book, and so some of the scenes involving Ripley's spirals into paranoia felt a little bit repetitive to me. But yeah, I think I'll pick up the second book eventually, and overall just thought this was a great read. The Scarlet Pimpernel by Orczy. This is an older British classic, and I think based on the cover that I'm showing, you would think this would be like a really stuffy and dense book, but it's not. It's totally a fluff read that apparently was the first piece of literature that really popularized the character of the vigilante with a secret identity. So yeah, this is totally a swashbuckling romp of a story. It takes place during the French Revolution, specifically the Reign of Terror, and our titular character, the Scarlet Pimpernel, is the leader of this band of British gentlemen who conspire to save French aristocrats from the guillotine. And of course our hero has to throw people off a scent, and so he plays this foppish dandy by day, but in reality is this super slick, big brain daredevil. And yeah, I just have a soft spot for these types of escapist adventure stories. It's totally unserious, very melodramatic. You kind of know exactly how the story's gonna go. You've got all your classic character archetypes. You've got your fox-faced, mustache-twirling villain who is this French agent, and we get scenes of this man like rubbing his little hands together at the thought of catching the Pimpernel, but he just gets outwitted at every turn. Our main girl is Marguerite, who is actually the character that we experienced most of the story through, and I liked her for the most part. You know, she's not like a feminist icon or anything. She might be a little bit of a dummy in some places, but once she finally gets with the program, she is ride or die, and I thought she made some pretty bold decisions in the latter half of the book. The writing definitely has dramatic flourish to it. It has a bunch of these old-timey expressions that I thought were really silly, but yeah, I thought it was pretty easy to read, and it ended up being like a real page turner, especially once you hit like the 25% mark. I think the plot really takes off from there. Also, I really thought I had the story figured out like beat for beat, but there was still a final reveal in this book that caught me by surprise, which was very fun for me. I will flag here though that this was published in 1905, and so there's definitely some very questionable shit in here. Things like very rampant anti-Semitism. I'd also say I wouldn't really call this a super action-heavy plot. Like most of the heroics happen off-page, and so a lot of this is Marguerite like eavesdropping on conversations and her doing a lot of hand-wringing, not knowing what to do with the information she finds out about. But I didn't mind that. I still thought it built great tension, though I can see people getting kind of annoyed with her inner monologue. Also lasting here, but some of the plot armor in the third act of this book is absolutely insane. But honestly, that didn't really take away too much from my experience. Like, this is a freaking superhero story. I just feel like it wouldn't hit the same if the plot was actually reasonable. But yeah, I went into this wanting to just revel in something that was super soapy and fun, and I thought it delivered on exactly that. Life for Sale by Yukio Mishima. This is a totally absurd, very campy little book by a Japanese author who is apparently a pretty big name in literature. He had been nominated for the Nobel Prize a couple of times. I was poking around this author's Wikipedia page, and this man led a pretty wild life. He was a Japanese ultranationalist who tried to orchestrate a political coup in 1970, which failed and ended in him committing seppuku. But yeah, this was one of his later works. I really can't imagine this being considered as part of like the serious literature part of this man's bibliography, but I loved it. The premise here is we're following a young man named Hanyo, who is in his 20s, and from the very first page we learn that this man has just woken up from a failed suicide attempt, which he's kind of bummed out about, but he's like too lazy to go through with a second attempt, so he decides to put his life up for sale in a newspaper ad. And this ends up being like a pretty lucrative business for him. He meets a bunch of shady people who become his customers, and there's a bunch of these ridiculous hijinks that ensue, which initially comes at a surprise to Hanyo because he's expecting to die after each customer's assignment, but he like never does, and he just gets paid like increasingly obscene amounts of money. The plot is totally bonkers, very pulpy. I'm going to tease some plotlines here, so I'll put a spoiler tag. Basically, over the course of this book, Hanyo meets a vampire. He gets involved in what I think think is the Yakuza. There's also this international espionage situation that happens, which leads to one of my absolute favorite scenes in this book, where Hanyo literally out of the blue pulls out this Sherlock Holmes style deductive monologue, and he starts like spitting bars about like the chemical properties of a specific vegetable. It is so stupid. There are insane leaps of logic made by the characters in order to move to the next plot point. And it's just so absurdly fun and entertaining to me. Also throughout the book, we're getting these small nuggets of philosophy and what I think were like critiques of post-war Japanese society, which I'm sure other people can glean a lot more from than I can. But basically my biggest takeaways from that was just Mishima saying that like life was inherently meaningless. This ends up being a really easy read because the writing is very sparse and direct, but there's still a lot of wry turns of phrase that I thought were delightful. And I just thought it was the perfect delivery for this kind of story. In terms of some of the issues, I will warn folks that the depiction of women in this book was incredibly uncharitable. Every single female character is just like falling over themselves trying to sleep with Hanyo. And it just feels so over the top and silly in this kind of story that it just transcends being offensive to me, and I just can't take it seriously, despite whatever the author's intentions were. But I can understand people getting turned off by that. But yeah, this was just a brand of absurd, goofy pulp that just personally really hit for me, and I had a great time reading this. Hunchback by Sawi Chikawa. This is a short piece of Japanese translated fiction that was actually longlisted for the International Booker Prize this year, and apparently this is the debut novel from this author. The story here is about the life of this middle-aged Japanese woman named Shaka. She suffers from a debilitating muscle disorder, and it's actually the same condition that the author herself has. Because of this condition, Shaka's muscles can no longer support her weight, and so her body has become contorted to the point where her lungs are getting crushed. She's been forced to get a tracheostomy in order to breathe. She relies on invasive medical devices in order to stay alive, and so because of this, she is confined to a care facility, and most of the book takes place over a 3 to 4 day span at this care facility. We're just spending time in Shaka's head. We get to see what her day-to-day routine is, what her deepest, darkest desires are. A lot of this is a critique on Japanese societal views towards disabled people. It's an inside look at how someone copes with disability and also how that shapes someone's sense of agency and identity. And I also think it's saying something about like people's tendencies to assign hierarchies to suffering and privilege. Might have also reached on that one. But yeah, I thought this was an awesome read. I just think it's super clear in the writing that this author has a really unique perspective. There's just so much interesting detail around the inner life and worldview of this character. Really great specificity in how this character interacts with her environment. And also, you probably wouldn't expect it from the premise that I've described, but this book is also funny as shit. But of course, in a very like dark and uncomfortable and ironic kind of way. It's also very raunchy. The tone here is completely unflinching and unsentimental. There's so many unexpected sharp turns in the writing that are played for humor that I thought were really clever. And I thought those moments really balanced out some of the more overt commentary that sometimes came off as a bit academic in my view. I thought Shaka was a really compelling and well fleshed out character. She's extremely self-aware and sardonic. And so despite her making like genuine attempts at trying to like reclaim her identity and personhood, she will like mock her own efforts and will also poke fun at the absurdities in her own life, which there are many, because a lot of what she spends her time doing is writing online erotica and being a Twitter troll. And so you get moments of humor where Shaka is like giving her opinion on the stylization of female sex sounds in erotic writing. The book actually opens with an erotic scene that Shaka has written, and then there's this whiplash moment that we get when we're finally introduced to the character for the first time in her disability. I thought that was such a brutal moment. And there's also moments in her inner monologue where it seems she shows like genuine contempt and disdain towards the reader, which I thought was really interesting. And yeah, it's just overall a really provocative story. Like one of the central plot points, which this is given away in the blurb by the way, but it involves Shaka being really fixated on the idea of abortion as a way of regaining her autonomy and personhood. And so she ends up paying this seedy caretaker in order for him to impregnate her. And then from there, the plot direction gets pretty bleak. And then the ending is a total curveball, like genuinely a what the fuck moment. And I definitely don't have the ability to properly dissect the authorial intent behind an ending like that, but I am going to talk about it very briefly and kind of vaguely. So I'll put a spoiler tag here. But basically there is a reframing situation that happens at the very end of this book. And to me, it just ends in like a really depressing and sad place, with Shaka as the disabled woman becoming like a footnote in her own story. And yeah, like this dream of hers of becoming a person, at least in how she defines it, is like a completely fruitless ambition. Oh, one other thing I note here, there's actually quite a few intertextual references in this book. There's specifically a Bible quote that gets thrown in here. Yeah, don't know what the function of that was, and that's not for lack of trying. I did Google this quote. There's been no light bulb moment, and so I've just unfortunately had to give up. But it didn't take away from my enjoyment of the book. Highly recommend this one. I thought it was a really unique read, lots to unpack, and would love to hear other people's thoughts on it. My favorite book on this list is Sabella by Tanith Lee. I would categorize this as gothic, sad girl sci-fi. This is the second book I've read from this author, who was an incredibly prolific fantasy and sci-fi writer. Her backlist, according to Wikipedia, is something like 90 novels, which is great news to me because I read Vivia last year, now Sabella, and both are all-timers for me. In terms of the story, it is set on Mars, which humans have successfully colonized. We are following our main character, Sabella, who I think is in her like early 20s. She's an orphan, and she also happens to be a vampire. And in this world, vampirism like isn't really a thing that people know about. It's very much like a Twilight situation where she needs to keep this under wraps. She is able to feed off animals, which she does at night because she can't really take too much sun exposure. And so she ends up living a pretty isolated existence. The plot really kicks off when Sabella receives an invitation to her aunt's funeral, which takes place in another city. And on her way there, she ends up getting entangled with a man that she meets on the plane. And the rest of the book is about the consequences that come from that. There are so many things that stand out to me about this story. I just love Tanith Lee's writing. It just has that it factor for me personally. It's got this darkly poetic feel to it. I think it's evocative, just the right amount of drama, just the right amount of edge. And because this woman has written apparently over 300 short stories, I think she has incredibly economical prose. There is no bloat in the story. She doesn't need to inundate you with world building details in order to paint a vivid picture. I think she adds just the right touches here and there. I loved her character work. Sabella was a really heartbreaking character to me. She has a lot of trauma in her past and is kind of like a gender bent Edward in a lot of ways. She's just so lonely and feels a lot of guilt over what she is. I just loved how this author conveyed her emotional state. Some of it was through these like feverish dream sequences, all of which I thought were great. I thought this relationship that Sabella had to religion was also really interesting. And probably most important to this book is the dynamic that Sabella has with this one specific character that I thought was absolutely electric. Anytime they're together, the scene just leaps off the page, especially the moment when they first meet. And there's this like cat and mouse game that plays out between the two of them towards the middle of the book. That was my absolute favorite part of the book. And I thought this story turned out to be like deeply romantic. In a dark way. In terms of some of the issues, I would say, again, I love Tanith Lee's writing, but there are certain moments and lines where I think it becomes style over clarity. I don't mind that personally. I think in the third act of the book, there's a direction that the story takes that I can see as being a little convenient, but I was too swept up in the story to care. And the last thing I'll say is the ending here definitely, I don't think connects the dots on everything. There's some vagueness, but that didn't personally detract from my experience. I like a bit of mystique in my sci-fi and fantasy. So yeah, I mean, I really love this book. I will be rereading it soon. And yeah, I just don't think Tanith Lee gets enough love. And after reading 2 of her books, I am ready to die on that hill. Well, that's all I've got for this round. Thanks so much to anyone that's watching, and I will see you next time. Bye.